As we know as Seventh-day Adventists, there is a very close relationship between the heavenly sanctuary and the earthly sanctuary. In Hebrews chapter 8, we're told that the earthly sanctuary was patterned after a model of the heavenly sanctuary. And, this evening we're going to talk about the Day of Atonement, because we are now in the Day of Atonement. Sometimes we emphasize so much what the high priest did in the sanctuary on the Day of Atonement that we forget that the people outside the sanctuary were supposed to do a work as well. And we usually focus on the fact that, yes, Jesus is performing the work of judgment in heaven, and he's cleansing the sins from the sanctuary, and that's what we focus on. But the people on the Day of Atonement also had a very important work to do in parallel fashion to what the high priest was doing in the sanctuary. And so what I want us to focus on is not so much on what Jesus has been doing in the sanctuary, in the most holy place since 1844, but what his people should be doing on earth while Jesus is cleansing the sanctuary in heaven. There are several very important points in dealing with this issue of what God's people should be doing. First of all, we know that the Day of Atonement was announced by the sound of trumpets, by the Feast of Trumpets. And the purpose of the Feast of Trumpets was to attract the attention of the people to the upcoming Day of Atonement, because 10 days after the Feast of Trumpets began, the Day of Atonement would begin. And the people had a very important function to fulfill on the Day of Atonement. And so before the Day of Atonement actually arrived, the trumpets announced to the people that they needed to get ready, that they needed to prepare for this awesome Day of Atonement. Now, there are several interesting things that the people were required to do on the Day of Atonement. First of all, several times in Leviticus 16 and in Leviticus 23, we are told that the people were required to gather around the sanctuary. It was required, they couldn't stay in their tent, they had to come and they had to actually gather around the sanctuary. Now, if you remember the sanctuary, the court of the sanctuary, the people could see what happened in the court, right? They could see the victim being brought, the victim that had no blemish, and then they could see the priest sacrifice the victim. But the people could not see what happened in the holy and the most holy place. Only the priests could enter the holy and the most holy place. And so the work in the court represents the work of Jesus on earth. It was on earth that Jesus lived his perfect, blameless life. It was on earth that Jesus was sacrificed for sin. There you have represented his living with us in the camp and his sacrifice at the altar of sacrifice, so to speak. So, Jesus came to this earth and people could see him. But when Jesus went to heaven, he was beyond the sight of people, and people had to follow him by faith. In other words, we can enter the heavenly sanctuary, but we can't enter physically there. We enter in our thoughts. And so the purpose of the people gathering around the sanctuary on the Day of Atonement was so that they could follow the work of the high priest as he was performing his work in the most holy place of the sanctuary. And by the way, this is the reason why the high priest had bells at the bottom of his garment, because the people could hear the movements of the high priest through the sanctuary by listening to the sound of the bells. The bells weren't there just as ornamental elements. They actually had a specific purpose. So the people were to gather around the sanctuary on the Day of Atonement because their minds were supposed to be in the sanctuary with the high priest, sympathizing with the work that the high priest was doing. Now, should we today gather around the heavenly sanctuary as Jesus is cleansing the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary? Of course we should. How do we do it? We can't go in there. We're on earth and Jesus is in heaven. We do it how? By faith. And by the way, that's the reason why God gave a description of the sanctuary. Do we have in our minds clearly what was in the most holy place of the sanctuary? The Ark of the Covenant and the law and the censer that was used there. We know what a description of the most holy place is, and the purpose is that even though we can't enter physically, we can follow the work of Jesus in our minds. And that's what it means to gather around the sanctuary on the Day of Atonement. It means that we're supposed to have our minds there focused on the work that Jesus is doing. Another thing that people had to do on the Day of Atonement, the congregation, several times we're told this, for example, in Leviticus 16, 29 and 30, and in Leviticus 23, verse 27, we are told that the people on the Day of Atonement were to afflict their souls. And basically, afflicting the soul, as you examine it in the Bible, means to have sorrow for sin, to repent of sin, to confess it, and to plead with the Lord for victory over sin. That's what it means to afflict the soul. It means being sad for sin, repenting of it because we're sorry for sin, and confessing to God that we are sinful and pleading with the Lord to give us victory over sin. So the people were supposed to be afflicting their souls outside the sanctuary as the high priest was examining the cases in the sanctuary and cleansing the sanctuary from the sins of the people. Another thing that the people were required to do on the Day of Atonement was that they were supposed to fast on the Day of Atonement. Now, in what sense do we fast today? Does that mean that we're supposed to fast from 1844 till today? Well, we would all be dead if we had to fast in the way that we usually think of fasting. We usually think of fasting as not eating. But Ellen White and the Bible give us a different definition of what it means to fast. It does not mean ceasing to eat. Actually, Ellen White in the book Medical Ministry, page 283, defines fasting in a very interesting way. Listen to the description that she gives of true fasting. The true fast, which should be recommended to all, is abstinence from every stimulating kind of food and the proper use of wholesome, simple food which God has provided in abundance. Interesting definition of fasting, isn't it? Why were the people on the Day of Atonement supposed to fast? Because they needed to have clear minds to follow what the high priest was doing in the most holy place of the sanctuary. What would be the purpose of practicing health reform today? Is it so that we don't get cancer? Is that the primary reason? No, that's not the primary reason. The primary reason for not participating of stimulating kinds of food and the proper use of wholesome food is so that we have a clear mind so that we can grasp what Jesus is doing in the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary. But the Bible also gives another definition of fasting. Very interesting. Isaiah 58, verses 6 and 7. Isaiah 58, verses 6 and 7. Notice this interesting definition of fasting that God gives in His Word. Is this not the fast that I have chosen? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and that you break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and that you bring to your house the poor who are cast out? When you see the naked, that you cover him, and not hide yourself from your own flesh? So fasting is practical godliness. It's meeting the needs of those who are less fortunate, the poor, the naked, not only physically but spiritually, giving clothing, giving food, and giving comfort to those who are afflicted. And so that's what God's people should be doing during the heavenly Day of Atonement. We are supposed to be, first of all, partaking of foods that are not stimulating and eating a proper amount of wholesome food so that we can have clear minds. And we're supposed to practice a practical godliness by blessing other people who are in need. Another thing which the people did on the Day of Atonement was to abstain from work. And some people would like the idea that we're supposed to abstain from work from 1844 forward. But the reason why God told them to abstain from work is because they had to gather around the sanctuary. You know, work would interfere with their gathering around the sanctuary. So I believe that what God is trying to teach us is that anything that distracts our attention from what Jesus is doing in the most holy place as our high priest, we need to set aside. On the Day of Atonement, the people had to gather around the sanctuary. That was their focus. They could have absolutely no distractions. And finally, on the Day of Atonement, while the high priest was cleansing sin from the sanctuary, the people were supposed to be cleansing sin from the sanctuary of their soul, from the sanctuary of their heart. And so we have all of these elements of the Day of Atonement, and I've gone through them because we're going to notice a very interesting passage in a few moments regarding the Day of Atonement. So let's review. First of all, there was an announcement by trumpets that the Day of Atonement was coming so that people were aware. Secondly, the people were supposed to afflict their souls. They were supposed to repent of sin, have sorrow for sin, confess their sins, and plead with the Lord for victory over sin. They were supposed to fast because they had to have clear minds to follow what the high priest was doing. They were supposed to practice practical godliness. They were not to work because if they were working, they couldn't gather around the sanctuary. And they had to do a parallel work of gaining the victory over sin, cleansing the sanctuary of the soul while the high priest was cleansing the sanctuary, because the high priest would not cleanse anything from the sanctuary that the people had not cleansed through the grace and power of God from their heart. Now, I would like us to take a look at several passages that clearly are describing God's people on the Day of Atonement. Go with me to Revelation chapter 6 and verses 14 through 16. Revelation chapter 6 and verses 14 through 17. Here it says, and of course we've read this passage many times, it says, "And the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man, hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, Fall on us, and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb." Which event is being described in these verses? What historical event is being described in these verses? The second coming of Christ, right? Very, very clearly. But I want you to notice now that the passage ends with a question. After saying, that human beings are going to be hiding in the caves and they're going to be pleading for the rocks to fall on them, the passage ends with a very significant question. And here it is. "For the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand?" So the second coming is described, and the wicked are hiding in caves and they're crying for the rocks to fall on them. And the question is asked, this is the day of God's wrath. Who is going to be able to stand on this day? Now, we need to take a look at what it means to stand. I'm going to go through several Bible verses that use the identical word stand so that we understand what it means. In Mark 3, 24 and 25, I'm not going to read the verses, I'm just going to refer to them. Mark 3, 24 and 25, Jesus stated, "A kingdom divided against itself cannot stand." What would be another way of saying that? A kingdom divided against itself will fall, right? Because the opposite of stand is fall, of course. In John 8, verse 44, Jesus said that Satan did not stand in the truth. What does that mean, that Satan did not stand in the truth? It means that he fell. He fell into sin. We also find in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12, it says, "He that thinks that he stands, let him take heed lest he fall." See, there you have the two concepts, the standing and the falling. he who thinks that he stands, let him make sure that he doesn't fall. So once again, to stand means to remain firm. It means not to fall. Go with me to Ephesians 6, 11 to 13. This also uses the expression to stand twice, and this is an important passage, so we're going to read it. Ephesians 6, beginning with verse 11. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. In other words, so that the devil can't get you to fall. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. That means to remain firm, to remain solid, to not fall. Notice also 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 19 on this expression, to stand. Actually, one Greek word. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 19 says, nevertheless, the foundation, the solid foundation of God stands. That means that whatever is built upon that foundation is not going to what? It's not going to fall. Now, what is that solid foundation that stands? The Apostle Paul explains, having this seal, the Lord knows those who are his, and let everyone who names the name of Christ depart from iniquity. So what does it mean? What is the solid foundation that stands? People are to what? To depart from iniquity. Let me read one more verse that uses this expression, this identical expression, to stand. And this one is dealing directly with the second coming of Christ. Luke 21 and verse 36. Luke 21 and verse 36. It says, watch therefore and pray always, that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things. He's described events relating to the second coming. So watch therefore and pray always, that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass, and to what? And to stand before the Son of Man. So when the question is asked, the great day of his wrath is come, and who will be able to stand? It's saying, who is not going to hide in the caves, and who is not going to cry for the rocks to fall upon them? Who is going to be able to remain firm and stand when Jesus comes? Now, Revelation chapter 6 ends with the question, who shall be able to stand? Where would you expect to find the answer to that question? How about the very next chapter? You think? If a question is asked, you would expect the answer in the next chapter. So let's see who is going to be able to stand when Jesus comes. Revelation chapter 7, verses 1 through 4. By the way, this is the chosen generation. This is the chosen end-time generation. It's a special generation such as never has existed in the history of the world. I call it the faithful generation. They will face death. They will not be able to buy or sell. They will be persecuted. They will lose everything that they have, just like Job did. But they will stand. They will not fall. So notice Revelation 7, 1 through 4. And the emphasis here is on the sealing of this group. Nothing is mentioned about their character in Revelation 7. We only have a description of the fact that they were sealed. Let's read verses 1 through 4. After these things, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, on the sea, or on any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, do not harm the earth, the sea, or the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. And I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel were sealed. So the answer to the question, who will be able to stand, is given in the very next chapter. The 144,000 will be able to stand because they were sealed before Jesus came, before the winds of strife were released. But we don't find much here in Revelation 7, verses 1 through 4, about what kind of people these were. It simply tells us that, before the releasing of the winds and before Jesus came, they were sealed. But the good news is that in Revelation 14, we encounter this same group again. But the emphasis in Revelation 14 is not on the sealing of the 144,000. The emphasis is on the character of the 144,000. And by the way, that's what we should focus on. Sometimes we focus on insignificant details like, well, is the number literal or symbolic? Well, I believe that it's a symbolic number. It's a much larger group than 144,000. God simply gives that number because it's related to Israel. It's a multiple of 12, and it's an intensification of a multiple of 12. But the important point is not whether this number is literal or not. We know that these people is the group that is going to be alive when Jesus comes. Those are the ones that Paul described as those who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord. That's the group. So the question is not whether the number is literal or symbolic. The question is, if we are alive, are we going to be in that group? And are we going to have the character that's necessary to be able to stand? Now, what is their character like? And incidentally, let me just mention this. This whole idea of the sealing in Revelation chapter 7, it comes from Ezekiel 9. So the background to the sealing of the 144,000 and the character of the 144,000 is found in Ezekiel 9. I'm sure that you've read Ezekiel chapters 8 and 9. In chapter 8, you have a description of all of the abominations that were being committed among God's people. Listen carefully. Not the abominations that were being committed by the Philistines. Not the abominations that were being committed by the Babylonians and the Egyptians. No. Ezekiel chapter 8 describes the abominations that were being committed by those who profess to be God's people. And if you read chapter 8, it's a depressing chapter. Because God shows Ezekiel an abomination that's being committed among God's people in Jerusalem. And Ezekiel says, Lord, that's bad. God says, you haven't seen anything yet. I'm going to show you a worse abomination than this. So then God shows Ezekiel another abomination that's being committed among God's people. And Ezekiel says, wow, that's got to be the worst. Oh, no, you haven't seen anything yet. I'm going to show you a worse abomination than that. And the sin that culminates the list is that 25 men of the elders of Israel had their backs to the temple of the Lord, and they were worshiping the sun. They were practicing worship to the sun. Let me ask you, in the end time, is the Christian world that claims to be following Jesus Christ, are they going to be carrying on an apostasy that has something to do with the sun? Yes. They're going to be keeping what? The day of the sun. It's called Sunday. And you say, well, Pastor Bohr, it's not the same thing to worship the sun as it is to worship on the day of the sun. And I believe that in principle, it's the same thing. Let me just express it this way. Who made the sun? God. Did he make the sun as an object of worship? No. So what happens if you make the sun an object of worship? What is that called? Idolatry. Who made the first day of the week? God. Did he make it as a day of worship? No. So what happens if you make it a day of worship? It's idolatry. And that's why Ellen White, multiple times in her writings, refers to Sunday as the idol Sabbath. And she speaks of the Christian world worshiping this idol. She calls it this child of the papacy. And she says Protestants have cradled and they have fed this baby. Because she personifies Sunday as a baby. And the Protestants, they've protected this day, and they've cuddled this day, and they've fed this day, making people think that this is the day of worship, the day of the sun. In principle, it's basically the same thing to worship the sun as it is to worship on the day of the sun, because in the one case you have an object that was made as an object of worship by man. The other is a day of worship that is a day made by man for worship as well. And so in Ezekiel 9, you have most of God's people in apostasy, God's people who claim to be God's people anyway. In other words, we are going to go through a time of trouble just like Jesus did. And so it says that they follow Jesus wherever he goes. They follow him to Gethsemane and to the cross. Then it continues saying, these were redeemed from among men, being first fruits to God and to the Lamb, and in their mouth was found no deceit. The Greek word is pseudos. In their mouths was found no deceit. And by the way, that means that the heart is clean too, because the Bible says, from the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So if your mouth is not speaking deceit, it's because there's no deceit in your heart. And then it finishes by saying, and in their mouth was found no deceit, for they are without fault before the throne of God. Quite a sterling character, isn't it? A beautiful character. That's the reason they were sealed. Because they followed the Lamb wherever he went. Because they had the Father's name or character inscribed in their mind. They sing a new song. They were not defiled with the apostate churches or their theology. There was no deceit in their mouths, which means that they had a clean heart. And they were without fault before the throne of God. But you know what's interesting? Revelation 6:17 is not the only place where this question is asked. Go with me to the book of Joel. The book of Joel, chapter 2. Joel chapter 2. And while you're looking for that chapter, let me just mention that the first 10 verses of this chapter are describing the second coming of Jesus. We don't have time to look at all of these 10 verses, but it's speaking here about an invading army. This is Jesus coming from heaven with his armies. I'm going to read verse 11 because that's the culmination of the second coming that's described in Joel chapter 2. So let's read Joel 2 verse 11, remembering that the first 10 verses are describing the second coming. Ellen White in Great Controversy uses Joel chapter 2 to describe the second coming. It says here, the Lord gives voice before his army. Is Jesus going to come with his armies? Revelation 19, he comes with the armies of heaven on white horses, right? So it says the Lord gives voice before his army, for his camp is very great. For strong is the one who executes his word. And now notice how the passage ends. For the day of the Lord is great and very terrible. Who can endure it? Are you catching the picture? The day of the Lord, the day of the coming of Jesus, it says, is great and very terrible. Who can endure it? Sounds very similar to the great day of his wrath has come, and who shall be able to stand? Now, where would you expect to find the answer to this question? The great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Where would you expect to find the answer in the book of Joel? How about the very next verse and the following verses? I want you to notice, in beginning with verse 12, that you have a description of the Day of Atonement. Notice all of the elements of the Day of Atonement. God's people participated in the Day of Atonement, and they fulfilled what the people were supposed to do on the Day of Atonement. That's why when the day of the wrath of God comes, they're going to be able to stand, because they've met the conditions of the Day of Atonement. Notice what it says in verse 12. Now, therefore. What does therefore mean? It ended with a question, right? The second coming. Who will be able to stand? It says, now therefore, says the Lord, turn to me. How? With all your heart. With what? Does that sound like the Day of Atonement? With fasting, with weeping, and with mourning. Does that sound like afflicting the soul? Absolutely. So, rend your heart and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger and of great kindness, and he relents from doing harm. Who knows if he will turn and relent and leave a blessing behind him, a grain offering and drink offering for the Lord your God. Blow the trumpet in Zion. Does that bring something to mind, blowing trumpets? Oh, it's announcing the Day of Atonement. Blow the trumpet in Zion. Consecrate a what? A fast. Call a sacred assembly. Were the people required to assemble around the sanctuary? Exactly. Gather the people, sanctify the congregation, assemble the elders, gather the children and nursing babes. Let the bridegroom go out from his chamber and the bride from her dressing room. No time for a honeymoon. And what are the ministers supposed to be doing? It says here the people are supposed to turn to the Lord. They're supposed to weep. They're supposed to mourn. They're supposed to fast. They're supposed to rend the heart because the trumpet has announced that the Day of Atonement has arrived. What are the ministers supposed to be doing during the Day of Atonement in order to be able to stand? It says here, let the priests who minister to the Lord weep between the porch and the altar. Let them say, spare your people, O Lord. See, this is not a time to be jumping up and down in church and rolling in the aisles. This is not a time for celebration. It's a time for affliction. Seeking out sin and through the grace of God overcoming sin. That's what we should be doing on the Day of Atonement. The celebration comes on the Feast of Tabernacles. That's spoken of in Revelation chapter 7, the great multitude. You know, they're singing songs and they're having a great time together. You know, the Feast of Tabernacles is the only feast that has not been fulfilled yet. We're in the Day of Atonement. There's only one feast left, and that will take place 1,000 years in heaven. That's the time for the celebration. Now is the time for God's people to afflict the soul, seek out sin, through the power of God, cleanse sin from the heart, as Jesus cleanses sin from the sanctuary. And so it says, spare your people, O Lord, and do not give your heritage to reproach, that the nations should rule over them. Why should they say among the peoples, where is their God? In fact, Ellen White says that during the time of trouble, the wicked are going to say, where is your God now that you're going through this period of suffering? God's not intervening. Where is he? So the ministers should be praying that the Lord will spare his people. Do you see that the question is, in Joel chapter 2, verse 11, for the day of the Lord is great and very terrible. Who can endure it? So the question is, who can endure it? Those who meet the conditions of what the people should be doing on the Day of Atonement. And we are now living in the Day of Atonement. But Revelation chapter 6 and Joel chapter 2 are not the only places where the question is asked. Go with me to Isaiah chapter 33. Isaiah chapter 33. And we'll read verses 14 through 16. Isaiah 33, 14 through 16. First of all, we have the question. And then you're going to notice that we have the answer. It says in the question, before the question you have a statement, the sinners in Zion are afraid. Fearfulness has seized the hypocrites. Who among us shall dwell with the devouring fire? Who among us shall dwell with everlasting burnings? You know, people, denominations that are not Seventh-day Adventists, they say that the wicked are going to be in the flames of hell forever. But the Bible teaches that it's the righteous that are going to be living in the midst of the flames. But they have fireproof characters. So it's not the wicked that are going to be in the fires, it's the righteous that are going to be in the fires. You say, really? Well, notice two questions. Who among us shall dwell with a devouring fire? Who among us shall dwell with everlasting burnings? And of course, who is the consuming fire? God is. It says in Hebrews chapter 12 that the Lord is the devouring fire. So who is going to live in the presence of the Lord, who is a consuming fire? That's the question. Where would you expect to find the answer? How about verses 15 and 16? Notice in verses 15 and 16 the emphasis on the lifestyle of those individuals who will be able to dwell in the presence of God. Once again, it highlights the character of those. It says, he who walks righteously. By the way, when the Bible uses the word walk figuratively, it has to do with behavior or conduct. So it doesn't mean walking like we walk from here over there. No. Walking in a symbolic sense refers to your conduct or to your behavior. And that's why 1 John 2:6 says, he who says that he is in Jesus ought to walk even as he walked. In other words, we should behave as Jesus behaved. So it says, he who walks righteously and speaks uprightly. He who despises the gain of oppressions, in other words, taking advantage of people, who gestures with his hands refusing bribes, in other words, they're not corrupt, who stops his ears from hearing of bloodshed, even on television, and shuts his eyes from seeing evil. He will dwell on high. His place of defense will be the fortress of rocks. Bread will be given him. His water will be sure. What is highlighted here? The character of those who would live in the midst of the everlasting fire. But this isn't the only place where the question is asked. Go with me to Psalm 15. Psalm 15, verse 1. Psalm 15 and verse 1. Here, once again, we have a very similar question. And then, of course, we're going to have the answer. It says there in verse 1, Lord, who may abide in your tabernacle? Do the 144,000 serve the Lord in his temple day and night? They most certainly do. So the question is, who may abide in your tabernacle? Who may dwell in your holy hill? What is God's holy hill? What's it called? Zion. Where are the 144,000 standing? On Mount Zion. So you see the connection. So the question is, who may abide in your tabernacle? Who may dwell in your holy hill? Where would you expect to find the answer? How about the very next verse? He who walks uprightly and works righteousness and speaks the truth in his heart. He who does not backbite with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but he honors those who fear the Lord. He who swears to his own hurt, in other words, once you make a promise, you keep your promise, as long as it's not against divine principle. He who swears to his own hurt and does not change. He who does not put out his money at usury. In other words, you don't charge exorbitant interest to take advantage of people. Nor does he take a bribe against the innocent. Now notice this. He who does these things shall never be moved. Would that be very similar to who shall be able to stand? Are the 144,000 going to have a very special character? Yes. But this isn't the only place where the question is asked. There's one more place that we're going to go to. Psalm 24. Psalm 24. This is an interesting psalm. It's actually describing, the song that is going to be sung is describing the second coming of Jesus Christ. And also it describes the ascension of Christ when he went to heaven. Now, let's read first of all the question in verse 3. Who may ascend into the hill of the Lord? What is the hill of the Lord again? Zion, where the 144,000 are standing. Who may ascend into the hill of the Lord, or who may stand in his holy place? Where would you expect to find the answer? How about the next verse? He who has clean hands. By the way, when the Bible speaks about the hand, it's talking about your actions. Okay? He who has clean hands and what? A pure heart. Who has not lifted up his soul to an idol, nor sworn deceitfully. He shall receive blessing from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation. This is Jacob, the generation of those who seek him, who seek your face. So once again, what is underlined is the character of the group that will be on the hill of the Lord and will be able to stand on Mount Zion. Now the interesting thing is that immediately after asking the question in Psalm 24 and giving the answer, speaking about the sterling character, beginning in verse 7, you have this magnificent hymn that was sung at the ascension of Jesus, where Jesus is ascending with the heavenly hosts, and as he's ascending to heaven, you have this responsive song. You have some angels that were left inside the city to guard the city, but most of the angelic hosts have come to earth to pick up Jesus. And so now they've picked up Jesus, and of course Jesus was caught up in a cloud, and so now Jesus is ascending to heaven, and you have this beautiful hymn that's being sung. Let's go to Psalm 24, and let's notice verses 7 through 9. Psalm 24, verses 7 through 9. Fantastic song. It says there in Psalm 24, verses 7 through 9, the following. Lift up your heads, O you gates. The gates to what? Of the New Jerusalem, right? Open up, you gates, and be lifted up, you everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in. Where's the King of glory? Jesus. He's ascending to heaven, see? And he's going to enter through the gates into the city. And then those who are inside, according to the spirit of prophecy, they ask the question, who is this King of glory? Now comes the answer from those who are coming with Jesus. The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. And then you have, lift up your heads, O ye gates, lift up, you everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in. Once again, those who are accompanying Jesus are singing this, and then those inside say once again, who is this King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory. And then, of course, Jesus enters through the gates into the city, and you have the scene of Revelation chapter 4 and 5. There the Father is seated on his throne. In the midst of the throne are the cherubim and the seraphim. Surrounding the throne are the 24 elders, the representatives of the worlds that never sinned. In front of the throne is the Holy Spirit in his fullness, represented by the 7 burning lamps of fire. And then Jesus goes before the Father, and he wants to make certain that his sacrifice has been accepted. He appears there as the Lamb, as though he had been slain. He shows the Father his hands and his feet, his side and his brow. And the Father says, your sacrifice is sufficient. Someday you can bring all of your people home with you. And then, of course, the angels who were silent because Jesus had raised his hand and told them not to sing, now there's an explosion of praise that you can read in Revelation 5, verses 9 and following. That's the scene that we have here. But you'll notice here that it says that only he who has clean hands and a pure heart, who has not lifted up his soul to an idol, nor sworn deceitfully. In other words, that's the kind of character that Jesus had when he ascends to heaven. And by the way, that's the kind of character also that those who accompanied Jesus had as well. Do you know that Ellen White explains that those who went to heaven with Jesus, those who resurrected with Jesus and went to heaven, she says that they were martyrs that gave up their lives to be faithful to Jesus. Now, if you're willing to give up your life, you must have been really committed to Jesus, right? And so these people, they had this experience. They could enter with Jesus into the city. But you know what? This scene is going to be repeated again. Once again, all of the holy angels are going to come to this earth with Jesus Christ. It says that Jesus is coming with all of his holy angels. Isn't that what the New Testament says? He's coming with all of his holy angels to pick up the rest of his people. See, he took the first fruits, the little sample, the down payment, if you please. But now he's coming to rescue everyone, those who are alive and remain, the 144,000, those who died in Christ and resurrect. And now he's going to take them to heaven. And the question is, who may ascend into the hill of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? And then you have a description of the character. And then you have this magnificent song that is going to be sung again. Who is going to be waiting in heaven for the arrival of God's people? God the Father is going to be there. You know, we develop these what I call myths in the church. You know, there's the idea, when Jesus comes, he's coming with his Father. No, he's not. At the second coming, Jesus does not come with the Father. In fact, Ellen White has a statement where she says that the Father will be waiting at the gates of the city to welcome us to the city. Furthermore, Acts chapter 3 says that the Father will send forth Jesus. Doesn't say he's coming with Jesus. He will send forth Jesus. So once again, you'll have the Father sitting on his throne. You'll have the cherubim and seraphim in the midst of the throne. The representatives of the worlds will have been invited there because now all of God's people are coming home. And you're going to have this wonderful hymn of Psalm 24 that is sung all over again. You know, this scene can be described by a parable that Jesus gave. The parable of the lost sheep. You know, we usually apply this parable on an individual in an individual way. We say, well, when one of the church members leaves, he's a stray sheep, we should be like good shepherds to go and rescue that sheep and bring the sheep back to the church. And that has an application. But Ellen White explains that this parable has a much broader application. She says that the 99 sheep that are safe in the fold represent the worlds that never sinned. They're safe. And by the way, there's not only 99 worlds. It's just a number. Just like there are not 5 true believers and 5 false believers in the parable of the 10 virgins. It's just a number that is given to fill out the details in the parable. So the 99 represent the worlds that never sinned. They're safe in the fold. The one sheep that went astray is this world. The act of the shepherd leaving the safety of the 99 to come to a dangerous world, to rescue the world, represents Jesus coming to this world to rescue the world. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And so Jesus is going to bring this world back into the fold. But there's one element that perhaps we don't emphasize very much. The Bible says that after the shepherd found the sheep, he placed the sheep on his shoulders and he brought the sheep home. And then he called all the friends and all the neighbors. Those are the ones that are there for the celebration. He says, come on, let's celebrate, because the sheep that was lost, I have found. It's once again in the fold. That's going to be a glorious day. And so we need to prepare for that glorious day. Now let me read you some statements from the Spirit of Prophecy on what we should be doing on the Day of Atonement. Are you following the study this afternoon? This is urgent. It's vital. Let me read you some quotations about what Ellen White says concerning what we should be doing while Jesus is cleansing the heavenly sanctuary. This is from the book Maranatha, which is a devotional book, page 249. From the Holy of Holies, there goes on the grand work of instruction. So the Holy of Holies, there's some instruction that's going on. The angels of God are communicating to men. So they're communicating to men something regarding the most holy place. And then she states, Christ officiates in the sanctuary. We do not follow him into the sanctuary as we should. Christ and angels work in the hearts of the children of men. The church above, united with the church below, is warring the good warfare upon the earth. And now notice this. There must be a purifying of the soul here upon the earth in harmony with Christ's cleansing of the sanctuary in heaven. So as Jesus is cleansing the sanctuary in heaven from the sins of the people should be cleansing their lives from sin through the power of God. And I know that there are people who say that we're going to be sinning until Jesus comes. The Bible does not teach that. The Bible teaches that God's people will gain total victory over sin before the close of probation. Because after the close of probation, there will be no mediator. We will have a protector. Don't get me wrong. Jesus isn't going to say, see you later, Take care of yourselves. You're on your own. No. Jesus is going to be, Michael is going to stand up to defend his people during the time of trouble, but he's not going to intercede for sin. So victory must have been won over sin. When you say that it's impossible to overcome sin because the flesh is weak, what you're really saying is that God isn't strong. Because you're saying that your flesh is more powerful than God. So you're really demeaning the power of God. Let me ask you, is God powerful enough to give us victory over sin? That's the big question. Of course he is. Is our human flesh more powerful than the power of God to overcome sin? No. You know that famous verse that says, I can do some things through Christ who strengthens me? I can do most things. I can do all things except overcome sin through Christ who strengthens me. No. All means all. He is able to keep us from falling if we meet the conditions. Now, I have several statements here, but our time is up. Let me just read you one or two more statements here. This is a powerful one. This is found in Great Controversy 6:23. You know, the question was asked this afternoon whether Christ had a sinful nature, and whether that means that Christ was a sinner. The fact is that having a sinful nature does not mean that you sin. Because sin is allowing the sinful nature to express itself in sinful acts or sinful thoughts or sinful words. Only when you allow your sinful nature to express itself in sin, then you're looked upon as a sinner. But having a sinful nature, a nature that is inclined to sin, that is bent towards sin, does not necessarily mean that you're a sinner. Sin is a choice. Sin is transgression of the law. And Ellen White says that's the only definition in the Bible of sin. Sin is transgression of the law. Now, in the light of what I just said, notice this statement from Great Controversy, page 623. This is in the chapter on the time of trouble after the close of probation. Now, while our high priest is making atonement for us, we should seek to become perfect in Christ. What should we be doing while Jesus is cleansing the heavenly sanctuary? We should seek to be perfect in Christ. And now notice this. Not even by a thought could our Savior be brought to yield to the power of temptation. Satan finds in human hearts some point where he can gain a foothold. Some sinful desire is cherished, by means of which his temptations assert their power. But Christ declared of himself, "The prince of this world cometh, and hath nothing in me." Satan could find nothing in the Son of God that would enable him to gain the victory. He had kept his Father's commandments, and there was no sin in him that Satan could use to his advantage. And now listen to the conclusion. This is the condition in which those who must be found who shall stand in the time of trouble. Wow. Amazing. In Great Controversy, page 425, Ellen White also states, those who are living upon the earth, when the intercession of Christ shall cease in the sanctuary above, are to stand in the sight of a holy God without a mediator. Their robes must be spotless. Their characters must be purified from sin by the blood of the sprinkling. Through the grace of God and their own diligent effort, they must be conquerors in the battle with evil. While the investigative judgment is going forward in heaven, while the sins of the penitent believers are being removed from the sanctuary, there is to be a special work of purification, of putting away of sin among God's people on earth. There's supposed to be a parallel work. And you say, Pastor Bohr, how is this possible? The secret is twofold. You know, overcoming sin, if we fulfill the formula, it's not impossible to gain the victory over sin. What is the formula? Number one, keep your mind from seeing everything that is evil. And secondly, focus your mind upon Jesus. If we abstained from evil, putting evil in our minds, and we focused our sight on Jesus, we would gain the victory over sin. But the trouble is, we're all caught up with worldly music, and we're all caught up with watching violence on television. We're all caught up on these things that defile the mind. And then we're not focusing on Jesus. We're not spending that thoughtful hour a day studying the life of Christ, which transforms us into his image. So it's not rocket science. The Apostle Paul says that beholding Jesus Christ, we are being transformed into his same image. By the way, that word transformed is the Greek word metamorpho. What word do we get in English from metamorpho? Metamorphosis. Do you know what a metamorphosis is? It's the most marvelous miracle of nature. Actually, it's of God through nature. It's when a worm turns into a butterfly. Let me ask you, does a butterfly look like a worm? No, it's a total transformation. So Paul says, as we behold Jesus, we are changed into his image. Let me give you an illustration as I close. When I taught theology in Columbia, I had many hundreds of students go through my classes, but I had one student which stood out above all of the other students. Presently, he's a theology teacher at Southwestern Adventist University in Keene, Texas. Brilliant. He would come to class every day, and he would sit in the first line of chairs. He would open his notebook. He had his Bible. He had his pen. And all throughout the class, some of the other guys might have been talking or distracted, but he had his eyes fixed on me. He was taking notes, and he was paying very close attention. Of course, he always got the highest grades. Perfect grades in all of the classes that he went through. Well, several years later, I was preaching here in a certain place in the United States, and a lady came up to me and she says, Pastor Bohr, do you know Jorge Rico? That's his name. I said, oh, of course I know him very well. And she looked at me and she says, you preach just like he does. Are you getting the point? In fact, a few months ago, we had Jorge Rico come to our studios to do a 10-part series on the book of Revelation. And, it was in the daytime, so we didn't have an audience. So I figured, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to watch him, I'm going to listen, because he has a lot of good material to offer. And so I sat down, and, as I watched him preach, I said, I'm watching myself. Why does Jorge, he moves his arms in the same way, his voice, he intones his voice a very similar way. Why? Because he spent 3 years in the classroom and had his eyes glued on me. This is a small-scale illustration of what can happen when we have our eyes glued on Jesus. That's why, Peter and John, it says when they saw their boldness, they knew that they had been with Jesus. And so on the Day of Atonement, we have to have our eyes focused on Jesus. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Shall we sing that song as we end? Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things on earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. In that song, you have my whole sermon. We turn our eyes upon Jesus, and the things of earth grow strangely dim. Because really, we're not going to take anything to heaven except our character. So if you're focusing on accumulating money and houses and cars and fame and popularity, you might enjoy 70 or 80 years on this earth. Like many, they're rich people, they're not thinking about Jesus coming and about living eternally with Jesus. Yet they're enjoying life in the here and now for 80 or perhaps 90 years. But we have an eternity ahead of us in a perfect land where there will be no suffering and no pain and no sorrow, where there will be no death, where we will have an abundance of possessions, limitless. And one time an individual says to me, I have a beautiful house. And I said, is it made of gold? He said, I have a BMW, beautiful car. I said, does it fly? There's nothing in this world that's better than what we're going to have there. So why do we focus on here? Let's focus on Jesus so that we can overcome sin in our lives. And that way we'll be ready to stand when the time of crisis comes. Is that what you desire? Want to stand if that's your desire? We need to take a stand. And we need to leave here and we need to get down to the business of developing our character by contemplating Jesus and barring from our minds that which defiles. Let us pray. Father in heaven, we come before your presence to thank you because in the last days of the history of this world, you will have an entire faithful generation that will make you look very good and make the devil look very bad. We thank you, Lord, that we believe that we're living in the last moments of the history of this world. Father, we need to form a character that is fit for heaven. But we need to do more than that. We need to go and tell the world what a wonderful thing it is to serve Jesus, to focus on Jesus. That it gives us peace and it gives us joy, even in the midst of suffering. The world needs to know this. The world is out there confused, without hope. We have the message that can bring hope and can bring victory to them. So Lord, help us to form a character that is fit for heaven through the grace and power of Jesus. And I also ask, Lord, that you will empower us to go and reveal Jesus in our words and in our life, so that many souls can join us in the kingdom when Jesus comes. Thank you, Father, for having been with us and for being such a wonderful God. And we approach your throne boldly because we come in the name of Jesus. Amen.